One of my favorite songs because it's a real song about real feelings.
For more than half a century, Neil Young has stood as one of the most authentic and uncompromising voices in rock music. From his early days with Buffalo Springfield, through his time with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, and into his legendary solo career, Young has written some of the most enduring songs in modern music history. With his raspy vocals, fiery guitar work, and fearless political statements, he has never followed trends. He has made them. Now, at 79, the Canadian-born icon has surprised fans by opening up about the rock albums that shaped his life and career. For decades, listeners have wondered, what music does Neil Young himself hold above all others? Which records inspired him as a young man, and which ones have remained touchstones throughout his long and storied career? Finally, we have the answer, and the choices reveal not only his influences, but also his philosophy about music itself, raw, unpolished, and unafraid to speak truth. These aren't just albums Neil Young enjoyed. They are the ones that molded his artistry, carried him through turbulent times, and, in his own words, still move him in ways few others can. So let's take a journey into the record collection of one of rock's most uncompromising legends. Here are Neil Young's 5 favorite rock albums of all time, and the reasons why each one left an indelible mark on him. When Neil Young revealed his list of favorite rock albums, he began with one that may not surprise longtime fans, Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited, 1965. For Neil, Dylan was more than just an influence. He was a symbol of artistic freedom, a reminder that music could be raw, poetic, and political all at once, released at a time when the world was in upheaval, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and a cultural revolution taking shape. Dylan's album felt like a spark that lit the fuse of modern rock. Songs like a Rolling Stone were unapologetic and piercing, breaking away from the polished pop sound of the early 60s. For Neil Young, still a young musician in Canada searching for his voice, this was proof that music could carry truth like a weapon. In later interviews, Neil admitted that Dylan gave him permission to write songs that weren't perfect, that weren't pretty, but real. Dylan showed him that a raspy voice could still carry immense power, that lyrics could challenge authority, and that rock music could matter. This was crucial for Neil, who himself would go on to write protest songs like Ohio and deeply personal reflections like The Needle and The Damage Done. Beyond the songwriting, the sound of Highway 61 Revisited struck him. Dylan's use of electric instruments scandalized folk purists, but to Neil, it was the future. He saw in Dylan's defiance a model for his own, a reminder that an artist must never be afraid to disappoint expectations in pursuit of truth. For Neil Young, Highway 61 Revisited wasn't just an album. It was a revolution, and it set the tone for how he would carry himself as a lifelong rebel in rock. When Neil Young included Exile on Main Saint by the Rolling Stones in his list of 5 favorite rock albums, he wasn't just celebrating a record. He was honoring a philosophy, a way of making music that embraced imperfection, chaos, and raw emotion. For Neil, Exile was more than an album. It was a mirror reflecting the kind of uncompromising artistry he valued throughout his own career. Released in 1972, Exile on Main Saint arrived at a turbulent moment for the Stones. Hounded by tax issues in Britain, the band fled to the French Riviera, setting up shop inside Keith Richards' rented villa. The basement of that villa became their studio, though studio might be too generous a word. The space was hot, cramped, and filled with tangled wires, smoke, and the constant presence of hangers-on. Sessions stretched late into the night, and not everyone showed up at the same time. By most professional standards, the environment was a disaster. But out of that disarray, the Stones produced an album that would become legendary. This kind of setting resonated deeply with Neil Young. He has always been suspicious of music that sounds too clean, too carefully constructed. For him, authenticity is born in the cracks, the mistakes, and the accidents that can't be manufactured. Exile on Main Saint embodied that philosophy perfectly. Songs like Rocks Off and Tumbling Dice weren't polished gems. They were rough, uncut diamonds, carrying the grit of the basement where they were born. What fascinated Neil most was the album's spirit of survival. The Stones were fractured, weighed down by drugs, exhaustion, and legal trouble. And yet, in the middle of all that turmoil, they made music that felt alive, urgent, and strangely celebratory. Neil could relate to that tension between despair and creativity. His own career was filled with moments when the pressures of fame, personal loss, or industry expectations might have crushed him. But like the Stones in exile, Neil always found a way to channel struggle into sound. Listening to Exile on Main Saint, one hears not just a collection of songs, but the echoes of a band clawing their way through hardship. Tracks like Sweet Virginia feel like weary sighs after a long night, while Shine a Light carries a kind of battered hope, an acknowledgement that even in darkness, there's something worth holding on to. To Neil Young, this wasn't background music. It was survival in sonic form. There was also a looseness in the performances that inspired him. The album sounds less like it was recorded and more like it was stumbled upon. Musicians picking up their instruments, finding their way through a groove, and letting the tape roll. Neil has long championed this exact approach. Whether in his solo work or with Crazy Horse, he often preferred the first take to the fifth, believing the magic of a moment could never be recaptured once it slipped away. In Exile, he saw that same commitment to spontaneity and truth. For Neil Young, Exile on Main Saint wasn't just proof of the Rolling Stones' endurance. It was a reminder of what rock and roll really is at its core. Not a flawless performance, not a carefully calculated product, but a messy, beautiful expression of survival. He admired the way the Stones turned their exile into art, their chaos into something timeless. It taught him that greatness doesn't emerge from comfort. It emerges from struggle, from persistence, and from the courage to keep playing even when everything around you is falling apart. And so, when Neil looks back at the albums that shaped his journey, Exile on Main Saint holds a special place. Not because it's perfect, but because it dares to be imperfect, and in doing so, achieves something truly unforgettable. When Neil Young revealed that the Beatles' White Album was among his favorite rock records, it came as little surprise to those who know him well. Released in 1968, this sprawling double album was a paradox, chaotic yet brilliant, fragmented yet unified by its sheer ambition. For Neil, it wasn't just a collection of songs. It was proof that music could hold contradictions, that art could thrive even when its creators were falling apart. The making of the White Album was notorious. By this point, the Beatles were no longer the cheerful Fab Four that had conquered the world. Tensions in the studio ran high. Each member began to drift into his own orbit. John Lennon was deeply involved with Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney was fighting to keep the group together. George Harrison was demanding more space for his songs. And Ringo Starr briefly quit the band altogether. Instead of harmony, the sessions often sounded like four solo projects stitched together. And yet out of that dysfunction emerged a masterpiece. For Neil Young, this was exactly what made the White Album so compelling. He saw in it a lesson he would carry throughout his career, that music doesn't need a perfect environment to flourish. Sometimes it's the fractures, the disagreements, and the raw honesty between collaborators that give a record its power. Songs like Helter Skelter were especially influential. Often credited as one of the first heavy rock tracks, it showed Neil that music could be loud, abrasive, and even a little dangerous, while still carrying artistic depth. On the opposite end, Blackbird demonstrated the beauty of simplicity, a single voice and guitar delivering profound impact. The White Album contained multitudes, from tender ballads like Julia to avant-garde experiments like Revolution 9. For Neil, this eclecticism was liberating. It showed him that an album didn't have to stick to one mood, one genre, or one identity. It could be as wide-ranging as life itself. Neil Young has always resisted labels. Folk singer, rocker, country troubadour. He's been all of them, sometimes within the same album. In the White Album, he found validation for that restlessness. If the greatest band in the world could jump from blues to folk to noise collages on a single record, why should he confine himself? That spirit of freedom would define Neil's own catalog, from the acoustic intimacy of Harvest to the distorted, Thunder of Ragged Glory there was also something deeply human about the White Album that resonated with Neil. While earlier Beatles records often projected unity and polish, this one laid bare the cracks. It wasn't afraid to be messy, uneven, even self-indulgent at times. For Neil, that honesty was the highest form of artistry. He once said that he preferred a flawed but authentic performance over something technically perfect but lifeless. The White Album proved that imperfection could be its own kind of genius. Visually, the album was just as striking. Its stark white cover contrasted the colorful psychedelia of Sgt. Pepper's and hinted at a blank canvas, an invitation to fill it with anything and everything. To Neil, it symbolized artistic rebirth, the courage to shed past triumphs and step into the unknown. That willingness to reinvent, to risk alienating fans in pursuit of truth, would become central to his own journey. For Neil Young, the White Album wasn't just about the Beatles. It was about possibility. It reminded him that rock music didn't need to fit into tidy boxes, that an album could be sprawling, contradictory, and daring, and still timeless. More than 50 years later, its influence continues to ripple through his work, a reminder that art is at its best when it refuses to be safe. When Neil Young spoke about his favorite albums, his inclusion of Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks was both expected and deeply telling. Released in 1975, the record is often described as Dylan's great breakup album, born from the collapse of his marriage to Sarah Lowndes. But to Neil, it wasn't just a personal diary. It was proof that vulnerability and pain could be transformed into art of the highest order. The mid-1970s were a turning point for Dylan. After years of being hailed as the voice of a generation, he was weary of the label. His personal life was unraveling, his marriage strained to the breaking point, and critics had begun questioning whether he still had the same fire that fueled his earlier work. Then came Blood on the Tracks. With it, Dylan reminded the world that the power of songwriting lies not in grandeur, but in intimacy. For Neil Young, the album struck a chord because it represented truth in its rawest form. Songs like Tangled Up in Blue and If You See Her, Say Hello carried an emotional weight that didn't hide behind metaphor or pretense. They were naked expressions of longing, regret, and heartbreak. Neil admired how Dylan stripped himself bare, letting his flaws and sorrows echo through every verse. It was the kind of honesty Neil himself strived for, never hiding behind polish, never sugarcoating reality. One of the most remarkable aspects of Blood on the Tracks is its duality. On one hand, it is intensely personal, filled with images of lost love and broken trust. On the other, it is universal. Anyone who has loved and lost can find themselves within its lyrics. Neil respected this ability to transform private pain into something that belonged to everyone. It's a gift he also cultivated in his own songwriting, turning grief over personal tragedies, like the loss of friends or family, into music that resonated far beyond himself. The sound of the record also appealed to Neil. Dylan initially recorded much of the album in New York with a stripped-down acoustic feel. Later, under pressure, he re-recorded half of it in Minneapolis with fuller instrumentation. The result was an album that balanced intimacy with energy. Neil saw in this dual approach a reflection of his own career-long tension between quiet folk and roaring rock. Like Dylan, he never wanted to be pinned down to one sound. Visually and atmospherically, Blood on the Tracks feels like a winter album, chilly, reflective, and tinged with melancholy. Neil, who often retreated into solitude during difficult times, could relate to the mood. The album wasn't about spectacle or revolution. It was about survival, about the quiet resilience needed to endure heartbreak and keep creating. Critics have long debated whether Blood on the Tracks is Dylan's greatest work. For Neil, the debate was irrelevant. What mattered was the honesty. He once said that he didn't care if a song was out of tune as long as it carried truth. Dylan's voice on this record cracked, wavered, and stumbled, but that made it more powerful. Every imperfection was a reminder that the singer was human, and that pain doesn't arrive in perfect packages. In the end, Neil Young's admiration for Blood on the Tracks reveals something about his own artistic philosophy. Like Dylan, he believed that music should come from the heart, no matter how messy or painful. And in Dylan's masterpiece, Neil found a companion to his own lifelong journey, a reminder that even in heartbreak, there is beauty, and in sorrow, there is song.